Hello everybody, welcome back to Inspirational Landscapes, Extreme Geography. We've only been going for a few weeks, but we've already covered quite a lot of territory. Our starting point was to say that what you see depends on your point of view and on what you choose to notice. You remember we did that exercise where we looked at the moon and we thought about the dark side of the moon, the far side of the moon that we can never see. But also, if we were on the far side of the moon, then we would never see the Earth either. So where you stand determines what you look at, but even when you're looking straight at something, we all see different things. You remember D.W. Meinig talking about 10 people standing and looking at the same view, and they all notice different things because of their backgrounds. And we tried doing that. We did that exercise where I asked you to make a list of all the things that were in your room, and we began by saying, oh, there's a table, there's a chair, and I said, yeah, think beyond that. Think of the biggest thing, the smallest thing. Don't just think of things you can see, think of things that you can hear, things that you can smell, things that you can feel, and now make a list with a hierarchy of what's really important, what's less important. And we gradually refined that list, and by comparing lists, yours, mine, each other's, we began to notice things through other people's points of view. And that, you remember, is what Marcel Proust said in Search of Lost Time. Discovery isn't just about going to new places, it's seen through new eyes. And habit, Proust made that really important point about habit. We tend to see what we expect to see and what we're used to seeing. If you go somewhere as a tourist, if you're lost, you're looking around, you're seeing all sorts, you're noticing different things because you're coming at it with that different kind of perspective. So we need to break out of that habit, and there are lots of different ways that we can do that. Maybe by looking at something as an artist, or looking at something through different people's eyes, like Proust said. We then moved on, and I asked you not just to make a list of what was in your room, but to make a map of what's in your room. We're geographers, so we're not just thinking about the components of landscape, but we're thinking about how to represent those. And we began by saying, yeah, we've got a bed, and we've got a table, and we've got a chair, and we've got some bookshelves. And again I said, well, yeah, but there must be more to it than that. Are you in there? Are you part of that landscape? Or are you an outsider looking into your landscape? How do we define landscape in that sense? Are we part of it, or are we external to it? And do what we did with the list. Don't just put the big, obvious, visible things. Maybe map, and get your colours out, and start mapping, well, areas that are more or less important in the room. Or map the track of your activity in the room, and where you spend more time and less time. And when you make a map, it doesn't just have to be the ground view like that. We could, it isn't just what's on the floor, there's stuff on the walls and the ceiling and all around us. So you could maybe fold out your walls from each side of that floor plan and start adding in material that's on the walls and have an inset for what's happening on the ceiling. There's this whole three-dimensional space that you can map in lots of different ways, and what you're going to put on your map depends on your point of view and what you're choosing to notice. And we went on from that, and we talked about different kinds of map and different components of landscape. I showed you a bunch of pictures of different artists' ideas of what constitutes a landscape, and whether is the sky a landscape, or is a face a landscape? Could a life be a landscape? Or if it isn't in itself a landscape, can it be treated in the same way as a landscape? Can we use landscape as an analogy for things? So if landscape can be lots of different things, and if it depends partly what our perspective is and what we're choosing to notice, how are we going to make maps of our landscape, or maps of our path, our route through this module? How can we make a map of anything if what's going to go onto the map is entirely dependent on where we're looking from, who we are, what our perspective is, what we're choosing to designate as important? Our maps are necessarily all going to be different. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing. We can each make our own map of the world around us. And we talked about strip maps, for example, which are really good for navigating along a line to a direction, to a particular destination. And if you turn a corner, your map doesn't have to turn a corner. You just rotate the compass dial on your map to indicate that you've turned a corner. We talked about stick maps from the Pacific, where the lines on the map don't represent things that you might initially think of being the key points of that landscape as an outsider, but as someone who lives on that landscape every day, you realise that Wave directions, for example, are a key navigational aid. So those are the things that you need to include on your map. Different things become important depending on your perspective and your situation. So we've all been making maps of different things in different ways. So thinking now about this module, and we said last week that, well, at this stage there's so much stuff coming at us, it can be quite overwhelming, and students often begin to feel quite lost at this stage in the module. And I said, great, that's a good thing, because when you're lost, you look at things in a different way. And that's what we're trying to achieve here. We're trying to look at landscape in different ways through different eyes. And being lost is one way of knocking yourself into that, breaking that habit of seeing only what you're familiar with. So suppose we're trying to make a map of your pathway through the module or through life, whatever. So there you go, that's you. You are there. And for a lot of people, the map of your journey is kind of going to look like that. You started over there, you've done this, here you are, this is what's coming next, and our destination is there. I remember I did this with a student some years ago in first year. I said, what is your final destination? And I expected them to say graduation or a career or something like that. And they said, well, eventually it's going to be death. Yeah, so a pessimistic point of view, but yeah, at the grandest scale, set yourself an epic journey here and see where you are on it. Or at a slightly more modest scale, set yourself here the journey of this module. How are you going to indicate where you are in life, in your module, in any adventure? Well, that's a very straightforward way of doing it. But if that's it, if that's your pathway and you're confined to there, so here we are, I can see the visible world around me, I can see 2 seconds ahead, 2 seconds have just gone by and there it was, and I'm traversing my way along this path. Well, what's out here? Are these other people's pathways? Do you want to put those on there? Or what about alternative pathways that you could have taken but you didn't? At each point along this path, your strip map, if you like, of where you're going, there are alternative pathways. There's a great poem you might have heard of. It's appropriate for this module because of something we were actually just talking about. And this is a poem by a poet called Robert Frost. If you haven't heard of him, look him up. And this is a poem that uses landscape to express an idea which isn't really about the landscape, it's about the life. So remember when we were talking about T.S. Eliot, and he said, the end of all our exploration, the point of all our exploration will be to come back where we started and know the place for the first time. And I said one way of interpreting that is to say that the more we go out and explore the world around us and engage with other people and see things through other people's eyes and have other viewpoints on the landscape, what that enables us to eventually do is have a clearer view of ourselves and of our own perspective and of our own opinion. So we know ourselves better by having got out there and explored the world. But as you're doing that, what paths do you take on your exploration? What do you want to mark on your map? If this certainly thinking ahead, well, is that what you want to do in the future, or are there diversions, are there byways, are there circumambulation? What are you going to be doing in there? And The Road Not Taken is this poem by Robert Frost, and he says, 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveller, long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. And he's deciding which path to take. And the poem is about him making that decision, and at the end he says, I shall be telling this with a sigh somewhere, ages and ages hence. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less travelled by, and that has made all the difference. So it's a landscape poem. He's in the woods, there's a path, which path do you take? It's an analogy for something much bigger than that. Here you are, you're in the woods, you're lost. Welcome to Inspirational Landscapes, you're lost. Here you are in the woods. What are you going to do? There aren't just 2 paths here, there are 1,000 paths. Remember what Proust says, the eyes of the 100 universes, 1,000 universes that other people see. You have all these options here. Where might you go and where might those lead you? So as well as our strip map path, what's out here? And if we think of it now in 3 dimensions and go back to the mapping of the room, there aren't just the obvious possibilities, there aren't just the obvious options for you to include in the landscape of your room, or in the landscape of this module, or in the landscape of your your long journey, you have lots of options, lots of opportunities of different ways of thinking about that. And talking about this, thinking about this early this morning, I remembered the idea of a story map, which is kind of what we were just drawing there for the paths in the wood, where you have the opportunity, you start over here, your story comes off in this direction, and then you're faced with a choice. And there are novels and there are films where you press button A to take, to follow path A. If you want him to murder to murder the victim, then press A. If you want the victim to escape, then press B. And then your computer game diverges in one direction or another. Or in the old days, it would say, if you want the victim to be murdered now, go to page 28, and you move forward, and the story would work its way forward. There's a slide here that illustrates some of the idea behind these story maps, where you basically have choices to make, and based on the choice that you make, different things will happen, and eventually you'll end up in different places, or you maybe will get circled back. Some of the dotted lines on there, you're getting circled back to an earlier position, and you get a do-over, you get another run at a particular situation. So that's a slightly more complicated version of that map of where you're going. But even that, I think, is going to end up, by the time we get to the end of this module, that's going to be a very simple version of mapping the world space, the life space, the environment landscape space around you. We want to try to develop that into something a little bit more sophisticated. So if we're going to have a key to that as to the various things that could happen, or the various things that we're interested in, one of the points we've been talking about over the previous couple of weeks is, well, what are the topics of this module? A few of you have said that at this stage it all feels a little bit loose, a little bit vague, a little bit wishy-washy, we don't know where we're going. Well, we're going to start now putting some firm benchmarks, if you like, or landmarks, however you want to think about them. We're going to be putting together the module in its component parts now, and you're going to be building up your map of understanding as we progress through it. So what are some of the landmarks or signposts or benchmarks that you're going to use as fixed points in the kind of wavy mess that this module currently is for you, with all this massive material to be discovered? And we'll go through this in more detail in the follow-up session, but just to give you a heads up of what's coming next, I've just jotted down some big geographical themes or topics here that you might want to copy down and think about. If you're using your notebook like I recommended, then stick these down in your notebook and just begin to get some of your own ideas about them before we move on to the next session, where we're going to talk about them in a more specific way. And I'm going to show you some movie clips in the next session, and we're going to try to look for these topics, these themes, these ideas, just in basically random movies that you might not have thought of looking for them in. So like in the same way you went into your room and you tried to do geography in your room, in your projects, you're going to be doing geography to your mountain biking or your baking or your ballet or whatever it is that you're interested in. Well, these are some of the topics that you could try applying to those passions, those interests, those activities that you want to do your project on. So I've just listed a few down here that we're certainly going to be talking about very shortly. So jot these down. I've got on my list here space and place. Well, everybody says geography is all about space, place and environment. Well, space and place are right at the front of that. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to think about, what's the difference between space and place? How are they related? How do we define those as geographers or in a non-geographical real life? Do we need to distinguish between space and place? In a kind of linked context to that, I'm going to talk about the idea of home and everything that isn't home, so home and other. And already you're beginning to think now, I guess, of my third thing. We've got home and we've got other, and we've got space and we've got place, and that's a place and that's a place, something in between them, there's a boundary between. Oh, boundaries, there's a good one, good geographical theme. So we've got space and place, home and other. Those two suggest our third theme, boundaries. Well, what are the boundaries between? It's all very well saying space, place, home. Let's be a bit more specific. What are the actual components of landscapes? So if you look at a landscape, you've done this with your room, but let's try and firm that up a little bit now. What is actually in your landscape? Now, when we start having that discussion, one of the comments I'm going to make back at you is, well, what's in my landscape depends on the length of time over which I watch it. I mean, that's a fundamental geomorphological principle that some of you will have heard me talk about before. What happens in the landscape depends on the length of time over which you're observing your landscape. If you look for a short time, one kind of stuff happens. If you think over a much longer time scale, a whole different kind of thing becomes important and different things are happening. So what's happening depends on the time scale. What's in the landscape depends on when you access that landscape, when you look at that landscape. And one of the really interesting things in lots of areas of geography isn't just the fact that things change through time, it's to do with rates of change through time. How fast do things change in geography? Some things are slow, some things are quick. That's a really important issue for us to think about. The other thing I want to throw in at the end here, because it's going to crop up a lot through the module, is the idea of characters or actors, if you like, within the landscape. Now that might be in a very simple level of when we're looking at a movie, you can literally look at the actors and look at the characters moving around within their landscapes and think about where they belong and what kind of characters belong in what kind of landscapes. But you can we will broaden that out a bit, and you have the opportunity to think about, well, what's going on in different parts of a landscape and how does that relate to the human occupancy or other occupancies of that landscape? Can we connect characters or actors with processes and with spaces or places? So those big topics that I've identified for you there, they all kind of loop around on each other and connect into a body of material that I hope, as we work our way through the rest of the module, those and some others as well, will kind of gel together for you into a I don't want to say into a fixed system, because I don't like the idea of geography or life being a fixed system, but at least being a framework or a constellation, if you like, by which you can navigate your way through these issues that we're talking about throughout the whole module.